It's probably an understatement to say that for the logistics industry and for FTA members, the implication of the UK's decision to leave the EU is absolutely massive. We're only just beginning to think through the implications that arise. It's very clear that it will affect all segments of the FTA membership, but that it will affect you depending on what you do in the supply chain and where you are, and it will affect you in different ways at different times. So whether you're operators of van and light commercial vehicles, whether you're the operator of a heavy goods vehicle fleet based in the UK, worried about the impact of domestic UK legislation, whether you are an international road haulier based in the UK or indeed in Ireland or on the continent, there will be different implications for you. But probably the most important and earliest implications will be felt by shippers and their logistics providers operating on a pan-European basis, and also global shippers and contract managers managing supply chains with the rest of the world. Now, this richness of impact and audience just underlines the diversity of FTA membership, and in order to try to understand the scope of the implications, FTA has produced an ABC guide to Brexit covering the issues that we believe will be important, and my colleague Pauline Bassadon will take you through those in just a moment. But the important thing for all members to understand is that today and for the next few months at least, very, very little changes. Indeed, we can't say anything about change until the negotiations are finished. You will have heard a lot about the Article 50 process, and this needs to be triggered and starting a 2-year process, or possibly even longer, before we know what the outcomes will be. And if you've been following the stories in the press and the statements by the Prime Minister, we believe that the starting of this 2-year process may be delayed to buy even more time. Indeed, as I think you're aware, the Prime Minister is in Berlin today with a key meeting with the German government. So in the meantime, FTA's message to members is to remember that we are still a member of the European Union and will remain so for the next couple of years at least, and therefore all the current rules continue to apply, including the penalties for non-conformance. Now, I'm sure I don't need to say that to FTA members, but it might be important for you to pass that down to your subcontractors and your other business partners, just in case there are some assumptions made which are premature and could land you into a bit of trouble. And indeed, at National Council just a couple of weeks ago, members took the decision that for the purposes of interpreting new proposals from the European Union, FTA will continue to assume that some or all of future EU rules could apply, and that we should continue to try to influence them for as long as we can, in case we end up having to comply with them anyway. Nevertheless, a key mission for FTA in the course of this time will be for us to understand what a good outcome looks like for business, and this webinar is part of that process. So please do let us know what you think. That completes my introduction. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Pauline, who will now take you through the implications of Brexit for FTA members. Pauline.
Good afternoon to all. I'm Pauline Bassadon, I'm head of European policy at FTA, and I'm going to take you through the FTA ABC Guide to Brexit. But first of all, I would like to say a quick word about Article 50 and how it works. So next slide, please. So Article 50, you've heard about that a lot, and we are going to hear more about that in the coming months, probably. This is the procedure set out in the EU treaties, which explains how a member state can leave the European Union. Basically, the ball is in the UK's corner at the moment, so the Prime Minister needs to first trigger Article 50, then the European Council, minus the UK of course, will have to agree guidelines for how the negotiations with the UK are going to take place. A Council task force is already in place, and they are just waiting for the Prime Minister to trigger Article 50 in order to start the formal negotiations. As James mentioned, there will be a 2-year negotiation period for the withdrawal agreement, taking into account future arrangements for the relationship between the EU and the UK. If a deal is reached, then UK leaves after these 2 years, and new arrangements would apply. These would probably include transitional measures, because it's quite a lot of work to just unpick all legislation at once, and it's unlikely to happen like that. So there would be a period of transition, probably. If no deal is reached at that point in time, then the negotiations can be extended, but that requires the unanimous approval of all member states. And if no deal is reached and no extension is secured, then the WTO rules would apply. Obviously, this would be temporary, because the UK would seek to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU going forward, and would be a worst-case scenario, but it's still worth considering. I'm now going to take you through the implications of Brexit for FTA members. That's our ABC guide. Basically, we came up with one issue per letter of the alphabet, starting with access to the single market, which is probably the biggest issue, to join in with FTA to stay informed and influential. But more about access to the single market, which is the next slide. This is really crucial. It will define the trading relationship that we are going to have between the UK and the rest of the European Union. And why is this the single most important element to negotiate for government? Well, that's because many other issues are going to depend on it. The kind of customs procedures that we get, the customs tariff that we get, whether we adopt EU laws or not, which ones, to which extent. All of this will be very much dependent on what kind of arrangement we get on access to the single market. Various models are available, obviously, but the UK could also negotiate its own deal. That would have the advantage of being tailor-made, obviously if other EU member states can be persuaded, but it would take a bit more time. Next, please. There are various trading relationships already that can be analyzed, various models that we can look at. Obviously, it's just useful guidance at this point because we are unlikely to follow very strictly one of these, but it's still useful background information to have. They go from the Norwegian model, which is quite integrated. Norway is within the European Economic Area, has almost full access to the single market, but in return has to implement most of the EU rules, including in the field of transport, for instance, and also contributes to the EU budget. Norway has also common competition rules, state aid and procurement rules, for instance. Then you have the Swiss model. That's over 100 bilateral deals with the European Union, which were agreed in 1999, 2004, and most recently 2010. These rules are managed by about 15 joint committees. Obviously, Switzerland has to implement many EU rules and also contributes to EU funding programs in return for all of this. Some of these agreements, for instance, focus on technical trade barriers or air and land transport. Then you have the Turkish model. Turkey is outside the EEA, but in a customs union with the EU since 1995. It has common external tariffs with the EU and has to implement EU industrial standards. You have the Canadian model, which is being discussed, in fact, and negotiated at the moment. The negotiations were launched in 1999. This is called CETA, but it's fair to note that the negotiations are not yet completed. They should remove 99% of the trade barriers between Canada and the EU. And then you have the least integrated of all, the Russian model. There's a new bilateral agreement in preparation, building on WTO rules, which focuses on improving the regulatory environment and strengthening the bilateral trade relationships between Russia and the EU. But it's fair to note that the negotiations started in 2008 and have been stopped for a few years. Now, B stands for border controls. So that's very much related to the issue of the juxtaposed controls. Currently, controls take place in France for inbound movements and in Kent for outbound ones. This is not related to our membership of the European Union, but rather to bilateral treaties that the UK has with France, where the issue is that a number of French politicians have been saying lately that they would like to move the frontier back to the UK and put an end to these arrangements. The problem is that some of these politicians could actually win the elections next year, so this is something that we will really have to watch very carefully. This could create huge delays if controls were to take place in the UK, as all vehicles would then have to be processed in Kent. So really something to watch. And we will be very careful at FTA to make sure that this does not happen. Then C's for customs tariffs and procedures. Trade is tariff-free and requires very minimal paperwork. In many cases, you wouldn't actually see the difference between conducting trade within the EU and within the UK, for instance. Customs arrangements with the rest of the world are also defined at EU level. But obviously all of this will probably change when we leave the European Union. And it's important at this point that government does not only focus on tariffs and quotas, but also on reducing red tape to bare minimum so that it doesn't become too complicated and we are still able to trade with the European Union. Then obviously D stands for domestic legislation, which is probably of great concern to all of you. A lot of the legislation that applies to the transport sector currently comes from Brussels, and government may decide to start unraveling UK transport flow from the EU legislation that underpins it. Obviously, the UK government's room for manoeuvre will very much depend on what kind of trade arrangements we get with the European Union and what are the related conditions. There might be very limited choice in terms of coming up with new rules, for instance. A transition period would be very likely, and this will be really a major task for the UK civil service. And we have to remember that obviously having UK rules does not mean that they will necessarily be more business friendly than rules decided in Brussels. This would have to be a new negotiation. It's fair to note also that international transport towards or from the EU will have to follow EU rules and international conventions. So if you want to operate in France, for instance, EU rules will have to be followed going forward. And that leads me to E, which stands for enforcement. Documentation required to accompany the goods, vehicles and drivers will need to be very clear and universally accepted if we want to avoid any arbitrary enforcement or penalties being imposed. Delays and administrative burden should be kept to a bare minimum. I already mentioned that. And obviously transitional measures will be key. Obviously the UK industry will have to remain very vigilant against unilateral decisions that could add red tape to cross-border movements. We see that today there are already such things happening, for instance with the French minimum wage rules, which were introduced at the beginning of the month. Well, the European Commission can start procedures against this, but obviously it becomes more difficult for us to trigger such a procedure and encourage the Commission to act if we're no longer part of the European Union. So something else to watch very carefully. Then F stands for fuel duty. The link between Brexit and fuel duty is not an obvious one, I guess, but Brexit will have budgetary implications for the UK. Although the suggestion of an emergency Brexit budget has been scrapped, the Chancellor could still consider an increase in fuel duties in order to raise revenue. The UK government is going to face huge costs related to the need for more civil servants, for instance, to handle the negotiations going forward. So obviously that's a threat which will be there for a few months, unfortunately. FTA remains very committed to its policy of seeking a reduction in fuel duty, especially as fuel prices rise due to exchange rates and commodity price increases. We also had to look at the global dimension and global markets. At the moment, the European Union has exclusive trade competence, meaning that no member state negotiates their trade deals by themselves, but this is usually done through the European Union. Now the UK, by leaving the European Union, will have to negotiate new trade deals with the rest of the world. Obviously this is an opportunity. We could get better deals than what the EU has, potentially, since they are more suited to the UK's economy. But in order for this to be a real opportunity, we need the right kind of transport infrastructure. UK ports, for instance, need to expand and to adapt in order to remain an attractive destination for the megaships. Obviously, investment in port handling capacity, in road, but also in rail infrastructure, connecting ports and inland distribution centres will be a must, all the more once we've left the European Union. And then, of course, there is aviation and Heathrow. Heathrow, again, is not related specifically to Brexit, but the need to have a very good hub for air cargo in the UK is even more pressing if we leave the European Union. This hub is Heathrow because of the grant of its existing freight handling capacity and the range of its connections with key global markets. So obviously, we consider at FTA that the government has to review very carefully all the options available in the light of the Brexit decision. Ireland is obviously going to be something we'll have to think about very carefully in the coming months as the negotiations are ongoing. There will be very unique consequences of Brexit for trade with Ireland, primarily because Ireland is the only EU member state to share a land border with the UK. To go from one part of the Republic of Ireland to the other, you have to cross through Northern Ireland. Many businesses also operate on an island of Ireland basis, and most Irish road haulage traffic to and from the continent transits via the UK. So obviously this is something absolutely key also for Ireland, and FTA Ireland will represent the Irish members' interest and influence developments with the Irish government as the negotiations are ongoing. And finally, perhaps the most important point, joining with FTA as the UK leaves the EU, we are really trying to reprioritize our activities to respond to this huge challenge, which is Brexit. We will provide you with information, influence and insights as the negotiations proceed. Our news channel are going to carry regular updates and breaking news as and when we get them. Committee meetings will feature also regular updates and discussion opportunities to decide on FTA policy. So if you want to influence this, I would very much encourage you to take part in all the committee meetings with FTA. We are already working with the Department for Transport on these key issues and are planning a major national conference in the autumn. So please join in with FTA, and FTA will try to lead for logistics on Brexit. And I'm now going to hand over to James for question time.
Pauline, thank you. We are now reached the point in the webinar where we are inviting questions from you, the participants. Just to remind you that these can be inputted through the webinar interface. And thank you for the comments that we received to indicate that you couldn't hear me at the beginning. I hope you can hear me now. Please do use that facility in order to submit your questions now. We will answer as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so, but if we haven't answered them all by the end, then we will do that in the next few hours and post them together with this presentation on the website probably tomorrow. But whilst you're submitting your questions and thinking through the implications here, maybe I can just point out that we are already aware of some important developments underway already in government following the cabinet reshuffle. There are obviously new government departments that have been created. FTA's advice and input is already being sought by civil servants to assist them with the significant task of understanding what the full implications are. And clearly we will be able to be reporting back to members in more detail as those discussions and interactions proceed. I hope you found that the structure of the presentation you've seen today will help you map out the implications for Brexit in your own business. We we'll be able to assist you in that as we gain more information. So we're starting to get some questions now, and I'm going to start asking my colleagues to come in on that. Rob Thomas has asked, how will the CPC and driver training as a whole be affected by Brexit? This is a question for you, Pauline, I think. This is a question of how domestic legislation in the UK, which implements EU directives, will be affected going forward.
So for the time being, as we mentioned, they won't be affected at all, because until the withdrawal agreement is signed, all EU legislation, including the ones related to training, will continue to apply to the UK. For the rest, it will very much depend on A, what kind of agreement we have with the European Union. We might have no choice and have to still implement EU rules. And B, what the government will decide. So it could also be that even if we have the freedom to come up with our own rules, the UK government might decide that they actually like the EU rules and they want to stick to them. So I'm sorry I'm not able to give a more definite answer at this point, but these at least are some various options regarding what could and could not happen in terms of domestic legislation.
I think, Rob, it's a very good question you asked, because clearly there will be a lot of drivers whose 5-year anniversary will arise during the next couple of years for the driver CPC. And I guess you, like a lot of operators, must be questioning, well, do we put them through their repeat course, or will the CPC cease to apply? Our advice at this stage is that if the driver is going to renew in the next 2 years, then almost certainly the requirements will continue to apply, and our advice would be to plan on that basis unless there is a significant change in the timetable, and we will obviously advise you of that as soon as we are aware. But this is a good example of how things stay the same until the negotiations have actually finished and we do finally leave the EU. John Feenan is asking for views on the implications of a possible hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. This is a key question for a lot of businesses with operations in both north of the border and in the Republic itself. And clearly it's not just a logistics issue, there are some massive political issues that would fall out of this. I think at this stage, John, we are not able to give an indication of which way this will go. I think what we would like to hear from members that do have operations on the island of Ireland is what would be the extent of the impact if those operations were having to be split and you were having to run them independently of each other, i.e. as a Northern Ireland operation separate from a Republic operation. And effectively to respect the hard border, and that there would be different regimes that would operate across them. This is something that we have identified as a particular possibility in the list of issues, and I can imagine that a lot of businesses would have to restructure and reconfigure, a lot of relocation of vehicles, never mind the introduction of new border transit procedures should the current border possibly cease to exist in future. Chris, my colleague, has a view?
Yes, I think it's important to stress first that the same arrangements are in place for the next 2 years. Of course, Ireland is a full member of the European Union, and the implications of a hard border would effectively mean that the UK fails to negotiate a single market arrangement with the rest of Europe as well. So it wouldn't only be an Ireland problem, it would be a problem for the whole of the European Union. And certainly all of the indications we have with our contacts with government, and I think from our major trading partners, is that is a situation that they don't want to let happen. Already we're getting clear indications of Britain's relative strength in its negotiating position with countries like France and Germany, where we have significant trade deficits. And I think the same situation applies to Ireland, in the sense that Ireland is Britain's single biggest trading partner. Understandably, why the Irish are very concerned, because of the amount of Irish exports, let alone the transit arrangements into the United Kingdom. So this is going to be one of the top priorities, I think, for the UK government and indeed the Irish government.
Okay, Graham Brooks has asked, would the working time directive possibly be affected? Yes, this is in the category of, again, domestic legislation which is underpinned by a European directive, and I think a lot of us remember the times when this was brought in. I think it is highly unlikely that the working time directive would be completely rejected. There is quite a strong lobby for some kind of working time controls to be retained. I think possibly the working time directive, though, could, or the working time regulations, as they would be in the UK, could possibly evolve in a different direction and at a different pace to the regulations and requirements on the continent. And therefore you do have a sort of a two-tier, a two-speed system set up here, where UK legislation is amended and is developed in a different way and at a different time compared to the original directives on the continent. Now that's fine if the UK is sort of acting and living completely independently of Europe. Where it could become a problem is for international drivers crossing to the continent, where perhaps the working time that they're allowed to work in the UK isn't recognised by enforcement agencies on the continent. And this is a real risk we see for international hauliers, where they are subject to different regulations for the journey whilst they're in the United Kingdom compared to the journey that they might be making on the continent. It just adds complexity, costs. It's another burden of issues that drivers are expected to understand. So the Working Time Directive is one of those that could go either way. I suspect some controls would remain, but it might be changing at a different pace to the rest of Europe. Dan Edmondson asks about recruiting drivers in the event of us not being able to recruit drivers from across the EU. This is all about the freedom of mobility of workers, absolutely core to the campaign for leaving of the European Union in the first place, and that absolutely right at the heart of the negotiations that have just started between the UK and the EU. I suspect that if we're not able to recruit from traditional sources of supply for drivers outside of Britain, then we really will have to look at our own terms and conditions and our own pay scales to try to attract drivers into this profession from within the UK. And I think it will be a real game changer if we're not able to draw on that pool of labour as we've had in the past. Mind you, we are not alone. There are many, many other sectors of business which are asking similar questions. And clearly this will lie at the heart of the negotiations that are about to be undertaken. Bill Evans asks, how high up in the order of change in legislation will the UK be in any of these issues? Well, Bill, I don't really know the answer to that, but what I can tell you is FTA is going to do its utmost to make sure that the UK's voice is heard, first by our own governments on logistics issues, secondly by the European institutions. We are still in Europe for at least the next couple of years. FTA, and in particular its Brussels office, will continue to have rights of access and a hearing in Brussels. And it will be our abiding mission to make sure that these issues feature in the negotiations which are about to take place. That is the promise we are making to members on this. That is a significant challenge, and that is what is confronting us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is just on 4 o'clock. We promised we would end the webinar at this time, and that is what I am proposing to do. If I could just leave you with a final thought. First of all, we trust you found this exercise helpful. I would imagine in many ways it was frustrating, because I'm sure we asked a lot of the questions identified a lot of the issues that you had already identified. But of course, at this stage, we're not able to give any definitive answers. But I do hope that on behalf of the team, we were able to convince you that we are on the case here. The categorisation that we will use going forward in order to organise what is a very complex situation. And we will continue to update members under those headings in the coming weeks. This presentation, including answers to any other questions that will come into us, we will be making available on the website for tomorrow. But just to remind you that you can stay up to date with us through our Twitter account, through the FTA website. I hope you all see FTA e-news on a weekly basis, and there will be more considered views and analysis in Freight and Logistics magazine on a monthly basis. Thank you very much indeed for your time and attention. Please do let us know if you felt this was helpful and you'd like us to repeat it again in the future, when we obviously will know more information, or do indeed tell us how we can improve on what we are attempting to do for you. FTA aims to lead for logistics in Brexit. I hope we get the chance to talk to you again very soon. Thank you for your time and attention. Good afternoon.